Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special webinar on the International Day for People of African Descent. Here at the WCC, we commemorate this gathering and the 75th anniversary of the World Council of Churches with this webinar, They Too Were Gathered. Let us pause as the late Dr. Agnes Aboom sets the tone for our gathering.
Coming from my continent, the historical part of this pilgrimage is for us to affirm our identity as children of God, created in the image of God, as we journey with others globally in search of just peace. Because the concept of pilgrim may not find an easy linguistic translation. But when we talk about movement and we think of the many, many thousands and millions of Africans who moved out of the continent, either forcefully, voluntarily, because of structural injustices, because of conflicts, I particularly reflect on three stations that will be very important for the church in Africa. One is for us as we walk together, move together with the rest of the global community, men and women of goodwill, to seek for reconciliation and forgiveness from our brothers and sisters in diaspora who were forcefully taken from us by the slave traders and for whom we played an accomplice role in selling them to the slave traders. The second station that will be very important for us is to look at our inner spiritual, theological understanding of our faith in the context of structures of injustice that are national, regional, global, that enhance ethnicity, that currently divide and erect walls of hatred, walls of death, and seek peace and pursue peace as we cleanse our continent from so much blood that is shed all over. Thirdly, pilgrimage will also entail for us as churches in Africa to journey with our northern church and men and women of goodwill in seeking to transform those structures that perpetrate and enhance injustice. The violence against women as a scandal within the church and without the church, so that we will be speaking as we move together from the context of the margins. We will seek as we pilgrim together to raise the voices of the vulnerable, marginal, and poor people who are not able to speak to the powers that be. We will engage as a World Council of Churches at the global level with those structures that are both of governance nature in working together to improve the livelihoods of many a people globally.
We are thankful for those words from Canon Dr. Agnes Aboom, and we invite our chaplain, Reverend Dr. Mikey Roberts.
Greetings to one and all. We continue in a moment of prayer. Let us pray. Faithful, eternal, and loving God, On this day, when we observe the International Day for People of African Descent, we do so marking and celebrating the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the World Council of Churches. We have gathered in this place and at this time as your people, the people of God, those whom you have called to yourself. We gather to remember, we gather to celebrate, in particular, those of African descent who have contributed to the global ecumenical movement over the years. God of justice, we give thanks for the sheroes and heroes who faithfully served and who today still continue to serve. Those who have in the past and continue still raising their voices against systems and acts of injustice wherever and at every level. May the collective witness of the faithful be a source of inspiration to us in this generation. We thank you for this opportunity to gather together, and we seek the guidance of your Holy Spirit. We give thanks for what will be discussed, for seeds that will be sown or seeds that have already been sown that will be watered. And above all, we give you thanks for the fruit that will be born, fruit that will remain. Hear us now as we offer our prayer now before you. In the name of the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. I continue today just to issue a brief word of welcome and to introduce to you our moderator for today, the Reverend Nicole Ashwood, who is the program executive for the Just Community of Women and Men here at the World Council of Churches. Of course, she has specific responsibility for the Thursdays in Black campaign. And today being Thursday, those of you who are wearing black and whose camera is on, we thank you for showing your solidarity in this campaign. I know for me, it is one day of the week where I don't have to wonder what to take out of my closet, and it makes life on Thursdays very easy. Nikki is a former education, was formerly at the Mission Society for the Caribbean and North America. And she's an ordained minister of the United Church in Jamaica and Cayman Islands. Thank you, Nikki, for your moderating today, and back to you.
Thank you so very much, Mikey. It is a pleasure to be here. Friends, colleagues, ecumenical partners, we are here for serious business. For as Canon Abom has said, that we are gathered as people who are willing to be vulnerable together, taking seriously our complicity and or our enslavement, but more so our participation in discrimination and xenophobic actions against others. But this is not my story to tell, at least not on my own. And so as we gather in this space, I invite the Director for the Public Witness and Diaconia Unit of the World Council of Churches to share with us a word of welcome. Reverend Dr. Kenneth Matata is a visionary who believes that the differences of people according to race, gender, age, and physical ability are not the basis of how they should be treated. He currently serves as a Director of Public Witness and Diaconia here at the World Council of Churches. As a former General Secretary of the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, Dr. Matata is a liberation theologian and a defender of the marginalized. A lifelong Lutheran who has also served the Lutheran World Federation, Dr. Matata envisions a world where our theological self-understanding and respect of human rights are foundational to all our pursuit for human dignity. Reverend Dr. Matata, welcome.
Thank you very much, Nikki. I'm glad to be joining in this important reflection today as the World Council of Churches celebrates its 75th anniversary. Since coming into being in August 1948, there has been an increasing interest in uncovering the contribution of Black people from different parts of the world in the formation and the growth of the ecumenical movement in general, but the World Council of Churches in particular. While the 23rd of August marks the 75th anniversary of the WCC, 31st August today has been set aside by the United Nations as the International Day for People of African Descent, which the WCC has faithfully marked in the past, including its special mention in the opening ceremony of the 11th Assembly in Karlsruhe in 2022. While the participation of white Europeans and possibly North Americans has never been questioned in the history of the formation and the growth of the WCC, questions have always been asked as to the role played by Black people from Africa or Africans in the diaspora in the history of the World Council of Churches. In 1948, the World Council of Churches was already acknowledging that there was a race problem in the world, including in churches in which the white supremacist ideology was impacting the Christian ideals of a held community. The WCC's commitment to the humanity, dignity, and rights of Black people was further highlighted and strengthened in the launch of the program to combat racism in 1969, following the Fourth Assembly of 1968 and the Notting Hill Consultation of 1969, May 24, 19-24. While acknowledging the race problem through the first three assemblies, 1948, 1954, and 1961, the World Council of Churches noted during this period that this race problem was incompatible with the Christian ideal of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Even more troubling was the acknowledgement that this problem was also entrenched in the churches. Both members of the WCC and those outside the WCC experienced racism in one form or the other. By 1975, at the Fifth Assembly, the theological conviction shared by members of the WCC resulted in the proclamation that racism was a sin against God. Yet this sin has not stopped a sin in the just ended assembly, the 11th Assembly, where the WCC bemoaned having to reiterate the 1975 proclamation because of the persistence of racism in both the church and the wider society. As the WCC celebrates its 75th anniversary, one question and observation that demands our answer is, what has been the contribution of people of African descent, the Black people, to the rise and continued existence and flourishing of the World Council of Churches? In recognition of this contribution, can we also see what contribution our African brothers and sisters continue to be a value to the fellowship? Due to the influence and persistence of colonial ideology and culture, part of the history of the WCC has not escaped from the whitewashing of positive contributions, with Blackness reduced in invisibility and insignificance. As part of the renewed interest and commitment to decolonize and to move the World Council of Churches beyond racial segregation, this event seeks to reimagine, to retell, and to reclaim the significance of Blackness in the history of the WCC as an integral part of the diversity of the fellowship, including celebrating the crucial contributions of Black people and people of African descent to the ecumenical movement. As we reflect today, may we be inspired by the promise of the Spirit that it is in the diversity of the gifts, in the diversity of being, that the flourishing of the fellowship of the people of God is fully experienced. And may God bless our time together this afternoon. Thank you. Back to you, moderator.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matata. Friends, I was not there at the beginning, but indeed, we do have colleagues and strong supporters of the World Council of Churches who were there. Some have done active research in the topics, and they will be sharing their perspectives to take us beyond race, to retell and reclaim the Black past in the World Council of Churches and the ecumenical movement. With me for this first segment on Black people in the ecumenical movement, especially in the World Council of Churches and their vision of ecumenism, are Reverend Professor Sam Kobia, Ms. Marilia Schuler, Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis, Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Let's hear from Reverend Dr. Kobia.
Well, thank you very much, moderator. I want to greet all of you gathered on different spaces across the world. And this is the ecumenical greetings that I want to convey to everyone here. Now, I just wanted to start by recognizing that W.E.B. Du Bois, at the beginning of the 20th century, made the famous statement that the 20th century will be a century about the race question. And that really has remained the case to date, not only during the 20th century, which also was declared by Dr. Philip Porter, the third General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, 20th century as the ecumenical century. Now, the question we are dealing with here is who were gathered at the inaugural assembly of the World Council of Churches, and we are saying that they too were gathered. And Philip Porter, as you might remember, those who were in Porto Alegre General Assembly, when I was the General Secretary, I called on all participants present to stand up who had attended the General Assemblies, the previous General Assemblies of the World Council of Churches. I started with Porto Alegre and all the way to 1948. The only person who remained standing when I called for those who were at the inaugural assembly in Amsterdam 1948 was Philip Porter, a Black person from the Caribbeans. And I would say that when we talk of the participation and the contribution of Black people in the ecumenical movement, and particularly the World Council of Churches, Philip Porter spans 6 decades. Philip Porter's footprints are there throughout until he passed on only just before the last General Assembly. So the presence, in terms of physical presence, we had Philip Porter and a few others in 1948. Philip Porter is the one who was chosen to be the spokesperson for the youth. And what he said in 1948 has remained iconic in terms of the vision of the ecumenical movement. Let me say that although in 1948, the first General Assembly, the second General Assembly in Evanston, in Illinois, in the United States of America, the third one in New Delhi, in India, it is actually the fourth General Assembly in 1968 in Uppsala that we can say that the presence of the Black people was felt. And I want to remind ourselves that in fact, the process that led to the 1966 World Conference in Geneva on Church and Society, there was very strong influence of Black people. Now, one Black person that is not usually mentioned in preparation for the 1966 General Assembly is Dr. Eduardo Mondlane, who was the founder of Frelimo, the liberation movement of Mozambique. Eduardo Mondlane was in Quito, Zambia, where the preparation for the 1966 Church and Society conference in Geneva, he is the one who brought, I would say, the idea that was to dominate the agenda of the 1966 Assembly. And I would say that when you look at the contribution specifically of the Black people, is especially in ecumenical social thought. Ecumenical social thought has remained at the center of the WCC Assembly, as well as the prophetic role in the ecumenical movement. Now, let me go back to 1960. In 1960, the World Council of Churches convened the Coastal Consultation in Johannesburg, where the issue of racism and liberation now became central. But it was in 1966, I would say, that the biggest contribution was felt. At that conference, which is considered to be the first genuinely World Christian Conference on social issues, which included equal participation in the assemblies, included the civil rights, racism, and freedom from colonialism. That is the time that the people like Burgess Kerr, who was himself with Philip Porter and a few others on the staff of the World Council of Churches. There was Burgess Kerr, there was Aaron Tolan, and of course, Philip Porter. Now, these would influence the 1966 Assembly, which was the precursor to the 1968 General Assembly. 1968 General Assembly really was extremely important because it is after Martin Luther King Jr. assassination, and he couldn't therefore attend the assembly. You know, he was the keynote speaker at the assembly, but he was killed before the assembly. And therefore, James Baldwin is the one who came to the assembly to bring a message on behalf of Martin Luther King and all those Black people who couldn't be there. And it was therefore 1968 that a decision was made to start the program to combat racism, which really was the most significant program of the World Council of Churches in many years to come. And then come 1975 in Nairobi, where I was a young youth delegate. It was my first General Assembly. But from there, we can say that we then have a whole team of Black people, not only from Africa, but from the diaspora, who therefore was there. So I would say that as it was mentioned about the Declaration of 1975 Assembly, that would then be the period that for the whole of the decade of 1975, it is the dominance of the Black people, particularly when it comes to ecumenical social thought. Dr. Agnes Aboom, who spoke a little earlier on the video, with me, we were among the young African delegates. And I would say that from that time up to now, the presence and the influence of the World Council of the Black people in the World Council of Churches has been there. And for me, in 2003, when I became the General Secretary, I would say then I became the second Black person to the as the General Secretary of the WCC after Dr. Philip Porter. And therefore, that presence, whether physically in the staff or physically in a number of assemblies, or spiritually, so to speak, in all other assemblies since 1968, we can say that the presence, the contribution, and the influence of Black people has been very significant in the World Council of Churches.
Thank you so very much, Reverend Professor Sam. I feel as if I was at school because some of these names are absolutely new to me. Ms. Marilia Schuler, a Brazilian ecumenist. But more than that, you were on staff as part of this historic program to combat racism. Marilia, the floor is yours. Take us through this experience.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased with the opportunity of being amongst all of you, in spite of the distance, but we are together. And it's an honor for me to be part of this group. And my dear brothers and sisters, I would like to, with my full heart, to share some of my thoughts with regards to remember, as we have been doing it so far in this gathering. And I would like to say that we have come this far because the grace of God, our faithfulness to Jesus Christ, and our guidance by the Holy Spirit has taken us this far in the struggle against racism and our commitment in church and society. And I wanted to remember, and we have been already remembering our ancestors, those who were by force and violence taken away from places in Africa and brought to the Americas, where I am at the moment, in Brazil, in South America, and all the Americas and the Caribbean. Our ancestors, grandmothers, grandfathers, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, mentors, and path building pioneers that come before us. I wanted to remember all of them. I also want to remember my respect to brothers and sisters who have been part of my ecumenical journey. And I would like to share some photos with you. And I would like to ask our colleague to include the pictures of Reverendo Antonio Olimpio de Santana and Dr. Jean Sindap. So Reverend Olimpio de Santana was a pioneer of combating racism mobilization within the Methodist Church in Brazil. He was also a member of the Program to Combat Racism Commission of WCC. So here it is, the picture of Reverendo Santana. He was so fundamental in my participation and my getting courage to apply to be a staff member of WCC in 1990. I only became a member of WCC staff in 92, but Reverend Antonio Olimpio de Santana, he was committed also to combat racism and empowering Black women in Brazil and elsewhere to participate in the ecumenical movement. So he was the one that gave me the incentive to apply for the job on the Women and the Racism program. But the second picture you see there is a picture of Dr. Jean Sindap, the first program executive of the Women and the Racism program in the WCC. She was my predecessor, but I had the great opportunity for about 3 months to be with her. She stayed in Geneva by that time, and I have learned a lot from her. And she was really mentoring me into that work that we were starting there in WCC. And we keep those two pictures there for the time being. And I also want to remember some of the elements that Dr. Sam Kobia just mentioned. And to say that the participation of Black people and people of African descent in the history of the WCC and the ecumenical movement is part and parcel of the history of the movement and its commitment as a Christian faith to the struggle against racism. Even if we were very few, if there was only Philip Potter present in the assembly in 1948, but we were already there present, because in that assembly in Amsterdam, the issue of racism was alive. And it was identified that prejudice based upon race or color and from practices of discrimination and segregation as denials to justice and human dignity. So we are part of the ecumenical movement because the WCC from the beginning have engaged in that struggle, and we are grateful for that. And I ask for the next slide, please. I also want to remember colleagues that have worked with me and WCC in the program to combat racism when I arrived there. And Barney Pitiana was the director of the program to combat racism when I got there. And these pictures I'm going to show to you is from that time, from 92, 93 maybe, these pictures. So Barney Pitiana from South Africa was the director. Reverend James Mutambira was executive staff of the program and worked on administration matters. The next slide, please. Mary Balikungeri from Rwanda, committed WCC person in the struggle against racism, and also committed to the struggle in her own country in Rwanda to today. She is pretty committed. And Reverend Deborah Robinson from the US, she was a former director also when in changing names, the program to combat racism was also called Ecumenical Action on Racism. And the next slide, please. I wanted to, some of you know her, I wanted to present to those who doesn't know that Reverend Yvonne Delk was the mother, in God of the Sisters Network, because she was the woman amongst ourselves in the Women and the Racism program and the WCC Central Committee. She was the one that named a network of African descent women, women of ethnic minorities, and indigenous women, and sisters. And sisters then became a network of the WCC, and it stands for Sisters in the Struggle to Eliminate Racism and Sexism. And it was a wonderful gift given from God through Yvonne Delk for our participation as African descent women and in ethnic minority women as well. And I wanted to honor that gift from Dr. Yvonne Delk. And the picture that is on the side. Oh no, go back, Walter, please. Could you go back, please? Yes. Those are some of the sisters from Latin America, Afro-descendant sisters from Latin America that were present in the first gathering of Women and the Racism. And then my last remember that I would like to bring to us today is transformative justice. And you see there two slides. One slide on the transformative justice, that is this booklet I have here. And the other slide is related to this booklet of the Women and the Racism. But I wanted to speak particularly about transformative justice because many brothers and sisters were connected, and I would like to mention their names. Betty Ruth Lozano Lerma from Colombia, Anne Marshall from the Christian Unity and Interreligious Concern of the United Methodist Church, the layperson Naboth Muchopa, Secretary of the Racial Justice of the Methodist Church in the UK. We worked together in this resource. And then this resource, we understood that it is a tool and a fruit of overcoming racism. Transformative justice is a tool and a fruit of overcoming racism. It deals with the past and the present. Its goal is to achieve justice, healing, reconciliation, and the reestablishment of people's relationship, which restitution and reparation are also a part. It affirms people's dignity, self-respect, and worth. It upholds justice, peace, and integrity of creation together. So in that note, I wanted to thank you very much for the opportunity of sharing those memories with all of us, and remembering. Remember is fundamental.
Thank you so very much, Mary Leah. So we've heard about ecumenical social thought and the prophetic role of Black people within the movement. We've been reminded about issues related to transformative justice and upholding the dignity, and we've been asked to remember. Perhaps it's time for us to continue to say their names. Reverend Marjorie Lewis, as one who was raised in the ecumenical movement, how do you weigh in, having been brought in the era of the Philip Potter?
Thanks to the WCC team, thanks to the presenters, thanks to everyone gathered here for what has already been said and the sharing that we will have throughout this time. Yes, the colleagues at WCC found the first reference to my name in the archives, 1979, when I was a final year student at UTC and the Central Committee met. It was a special time because that's when my first opportunity to experience Orthodox liturgies, Russian Orthodox and Ethiopian Orthodox, as it turns out. I want to also acknowledge that I'm in Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and to acknowledge the treaties of peace and friendship between the Mi'kmaq and the settlers, which did not cede land, but saw a vision of collaboration between the different ethnic groups. And I want to acknowledge here in Nova Scotia the over 400-year presence of people of African descent on this land. Just a little note to say the images we're going to see are mostly from WCC sources. One is from University of Ghana and one is from the Hope Publishing Company, but you can hear that later if you need details. Friends, I want to quote Hebrews chapter 12 and the first verse. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. So in these few minutes, we say their names. Wise elders and ancestors, some alive and some among the cloud of witnesses. We recall and laud their work and stewardship, their mentorship, their legacy. We lament their suffering, overworked, underpaid, surviving racism and patriarchy. And we labor on to honor them, to preserve the legacy, and to forge new paths into the future. Mercy Amber Odoyoye, we say her name. The stories I tell are more personal stories. There are official biographies that can be found in the Dictionary of the Ecumenical Movement and other places. For me, Mercy, of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, is someone who has modeled the lessons of judicious use of external funding to ensure that the group controls the narrative. The circle started with no external money. She models the birthing and success and sustaining of a movement, judicious succession planning, and the work of the Circle of Mercy and her colleagues actually inspired a publication that came out of the United Theological College of the West Indies while I was there, which was Jamaica Praying. She's also a model of hospitality, and I will speak of her hospitality along with another sister from Ghana. And so our next memory, or the next person I want us to remember and to laud, because they're both still alive, is Elizabeth Amor. We say her name. Elizabeth Amor has been a professor at the University of Ghana and a member of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. With her, I highlight the crossovers in ecumenical relationships that often, as was the case with Elizabeth, we meet in WCC circles, but we also meet in other ecumenical and bilateral circles. So I was able to meet with Elizabeth and Mercy, particularly in 2007, when I went to Ghana through the Council for World Mission to look at ways in which we could commemorate the abolition of the slave trade in the former British colonies. Mercy and Elizabeth exemplified good old African hospitality. I wanted to stay outside of the meeting dates and do a little bit more research on traditional African religion. They made a room for me. They found space to put me up in the office of the circle, found somebody to cook meals for me, found a driver to take me all over the place to meet academics, traditional religious leaders, and it was wonderful. With Elizabeth, I've also collaborated in another project that I was co-convener for with Dwight Hopkins, which was a global project looking at Black and darker skinned peoples under the theme Another World is Possible. And there is more that can be said about that. Elizabeth calls herself grandma, and she has been for me a wise counselor, confidant, and advisor in matters both personal and political. And so next we say her name, Marie Basili Assad. Marie Assad was one of the persons I met when I was pretty young. She was really fantastic. And my memories of her include just her physical presence, her dignity, her elegance, her love of attar of roses, fragrance, her fierce advocacy for justice. And in particular, I recall her challenge to liberation theologians, Black theologians in the Caribbean and the Americas, to widen the conversation about the place of Egypt in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Her challenge was to remind us that Egypt was not only the land of oppressive Pharaoh, but Egypt was also the place of refuge for the Holy Family. And I really have kept that, the challenge that in looking at the place of Africa in the Bible, we need a wider scope, and we need to think critically about how we apply the exegesis, the contextual theology, and other associations of how Africa is presented and understood, including by people of African descent. Brigalia Bam, we say her name. Brigalia too is one of the women I met when I was young. I remember Brigalia for exemplifying, along with other colleagues in WCC, methodologies about how to organize for the participation of youth and women. This was the era of the birth of the pre-assembly meetings. And there were concerns that delegates, women delegates, youth delegates were often unprepared to participate properly and really contribute what they had in the larger WCC assemblies. And so Brigalia and other women and other colleagues developed a strategy of hosting pre-assembly meetings of women and youth that could include not only participants in the assembly, but other youth leaders in setting the example. It was important because often there was a lot of gatekeeping, and some of the people who were handpicked by the leaders of the church were not the ones doing the work on the ground. Doreen Potter, we say her name. Doreen Potter was a musician and composer in her own right, well known for Let Us Talents and Tongues Employ, which use the Jamaican folk song, the tune of the Jamaican folk song, Linstead Market. I think of Doreen and want to just table that some of her collaborations were not acknowledged in the subsequent publications, and that when two of my friends, Pat Donald and Evie Vernon, were ordained as deaconesses in 1982, they asked me to sing a solo, and it was a Doreen Potter hymn, You Who Made Me Woman. It was a time when the Anglican Church did not ordain women as priests, so they accepted the ordination that was offered to them, even though they wanted to be priests. And finally, Philip Potter, we say his name. There's a lot that can be said about Philip, but I just want to share some personal notes. One, that in a conversation, he told me that one of the things he valued most about his time at WCC was when one of the secretaries said to him, she loved about him that he never forgot that he was a pastor. I remember when he died and we were putting together a remembrance, Professor Mark Figueroa, well known for his work in the Communist Party in Jamaica, said to me he would not have been able to get his PhD if Philip Potter had not intervened, helped him to find funding, and subsequently he and Philip and Barbel offered Mark and his family great hospitality. Final story I'll tell about Philip Potter is being in a car with him halfway through on the streets of Jamaica, and a beggar came up to us. And Philip looked the man straight in his face and smiled at him and offered this beggar who wanted to weep or wipe or windscreen for a few pennies a non-verbal affirmation that I've never forgotten. Philip too was a feminist, and I think it's not a coincidence that he married two very strong women who were confident and made in their own right special contributions to the ecumenical movement and to the church generally. And so we say their names. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Marjorie. And we say your name, Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis, visionary, politician, advocate, mentor, and activist. And in that vein, we invite Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker to share with us her experiences, because you have done a lot of research, and even recently at the 75th anniversary celebrations, you ensured that those gathered for that celebration during the Central Committee heard their names. Angelique, Reverend Dr. Walker Smith, talk to us. Tell us some more.
Well, I must tell you, Dr. Ashwood, this is such a wonderful moment. I can't thank everyone enough for what has already been said and organized in this moment. And thank you for your moderation. It's so wonderful to be in this space. And all of those who've come before me, you know that you're my mentors, my brothers and sisters in Christ, and we work so closely together. And I've learned so much from you over the years. I just want to say that publicly in this moment. I'm just very humbled. But I will say that I do have an upcoming book that is coming. And in this book, I had opportunity to focus my work on the colonial period of Africans and people of African descent, of faith and ecumenical leadership, primarily between the years of 1939 and 1983, with a focus on Pan-African women of faith, many who have been named already, and for this I'm so grateful. We have contributed to this movement, to the earliest formations of the global ecumenical movement through the WCC and related movements. For the purpose of this very brief time together, I would like to make 4 observations. Number 1, previous to the creation of the World Council of Churches, there were movements in the Pan-African space that were led by women and men of Christian faith. For example, and I believe Dr. Kobia mentioned this as well, the Pan-African Congresses that were in part a response to the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference that had an imperial agenda toward African and Africans in diaspora and divided the continent of Africa without our leadership of people of Africa and of African descent. But these movements and other movements were happening, but not visible. This is an important point. They were not visible to the wider ecumenical spaces and voices because of the colonial lens that did not identify and promote our work. So there is even much more work to be done of those who were invisible in those earliest days. That being said, I want to also acknowledge the youth movements that led up to the formation of the World Council of Churches, that contributed to and supported the leadership formation and leadership of the Pan-African peoples in the World Student Christian Federation, the Young Women's Christian Association, the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, in the 1800s and thereafter. I think about persons like the great Dr. Potter, who we've already mentioned, Dr. Mercy Odieyu, the Reverend Dr. Rena Karifa Smart and her husband, Dr. John Smart. These are those who were involved in some of these movements, and there are others I could name, but I named them in this moment. Number 3, I would like to mention my predecessor from my church on the World Council of Churches Central Committee in the Church of the National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated, founded in 1880. And this person would be the Reverend Dr. Benjamin E. Mays. Dr. Mays was the former president of Morehouse College, the historic Black college university in the United States, one of many, but one we name. Dr. Mays was also a mentor to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who we have just remembered this past week for the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. Yes, we remembered this last Saturday, and on the actual day this past Monday, the 28th of August. But Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, his mentor, was a delegate from my church at the 1948 assembly in Amsterdam. And after that assembly was then having been elected to the Central Committee after that assembly. Dr. Benjamin E. Mays convened one of the earliest ecumenical interfaith global consultations on race relations in 1939. And this movement gave energy to the first assembly through the international conferencing that happened prior to the World Council of Churches first assembly. Now, in the first World Council of Churches assembly, between August 23 and September 4, 1948, in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, the records show that there were 147 national churches from different confessions and many countries who came together to commit themselves to this formal institutional expression out of a movement that would continue going forward. In 1948, although many churches in Africa were quote unquote mission churches, or sometimes referred to as quote unquote in the documents, quote, younger churches, with primary relationships and institutional identities in Europe and the US, Africa, and the African diaspora. There were 4 historic Black churches from the United States present at that first assembly as well, and churches from Ethiopia and Egypt, East and West Africa, it was called in those days, and quote, the West Indies. But also present, and also mentioned by my sister earlier, there was the presence of ancient, this is very important, not just a modern movement, but ancient representation of people of Africa from the African churches called the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo Church, the Eritrean Orthodox Tawahedo Church, and as I've just said, the Coptic Orthodox Church in Alexandria. Although I focus on 9 Pan-African women in my book that were born before 1939, who were part of these movements and institutions, I would like to name the nine that I do mention, and 2 of them have already been mentioned, so I will not expound upon them. But of course, we all know Dr. Mercy Amba Odieyu, who has been mentioned, who also was a deputy secretary of the World Council of Churches later, and as already stated, the founder of the Circle of Concerned African Women. She was there in those earliest years and born before 1939. Dr. Brigalia Bam, who has also been mentioned. But I also want to call the name, born before 1939, of the Honorable Dom Nita Barrow, who I might add in my own personal story, enchanted me in 1991 when I was at the World Assembly in Australia, who took the floor with power and reorganized the whole direction of that assembly. We've mentioned also the Reverend Dr. Yvonne Delk, also born 1939 or before. Then I also want to mention also my other predecessor, Dr. Mary Olivia Wass, who was the leader of my National Baptist Women's Auxiliary. She too, the granddaughter of those who were enslaved in the United States, born out of the South, who lived with her grandparents who were enslaved, who tells her story that we try to bring forth in the book. And I also want to name Justice, the Honorable Justice Annie Joggi, judge, order, and relentless voice for justice from Ghana, who was one of our past presidents from Africa. And of course, we've already mentioned Dr. Marie Baselli Assad, an advocate for the care and divinity of marginalized communities and for justice. I also want to call the name of Dr. Sylvia Ross Talbot, who recently was deceased and who WCC rightfully honored in our press releases. These are some of the names. There are others that I could name, but in this moment, I call their names as well. There's much more to be told. The moments are short. I see my sister is on the screen, but I do want to say thank you for the moment to share just a lens, just an opening of much more there is to tell. And I'm honored to share some of it in my upcoming book. Thank you so very much. It's such an honor to be here in this moment.
Thank you so very much, President Angelique. Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith is also the current president for the North America region of the World Council of Churches. Friends, Marjorie shared with us from Hebrews 12, where we are told that there is this great cloud of witnesses. So as you watch, I invite you in the chat to write the names of those persons you know, whether or not they've been mentioned before. Let us say their names. Let's remember them and let's honor our ancestors. We've heard so very much about Reverend Philip Potter. And while we don't want to make him out as the only hero of the era, he was there at the beginning and he served as General Secretary. But rather than myself or Marcelo telling his story, let's allow Philip to speak for himself, after which Mikey will lead us in a moment of prayer.
My name is Philip Potter. I come out of a little island, Dominica, in the West Indies. And from my early youth, I was in the life of a church. I was a Sunday school teacher. I was a Boy Scout. Be prepared. and all that. And I worked, and then I worked as a local preacher, a lay preacher, and finally I felt the call to the ministry, and I went to Jamaica and then into England to finish my studies. And when I arrived in London, 2 days afterwards, I went to Oslo for the World Youth Conference. And there I had to make my first international speech. And the following year was the inauguration of the World Council of Churches. And I was there with 100 of us young people. We were the choir of the assembly, and I was sort of leader, and I addressed the assembly. And so that has been the beginning, and my life has been very full. not least later on in the, I was 12 years from 1972 to 1984, General Secretary of the World Council of Churches. And that was a very meaningful experience, difficult, and especially when we took strong positions on issues. But it was a really great experience. And the thing about I've learned ever since I was a scout is that, you know, nobody is chief. We all help each other in our weak spots and support each other in the strong spots and so on. So that has been my life until I retired.
As we reflect on these words and continue to use the chat feature to call and to mention and to name those who have influenced and continue to influence us today in our ministry and in our service to the world and to the church, let us pray. God of the past, present, and future, you are the one eternal God, the God whose divine acts can be discerned even in the often troubled course of humanity's history over time. As we continue to call to mind today, especially those of African descent who have served and who continue to serve the world and the church, we ask that you today, through the work of your Holy Spirit, will renew us as we seek to serve today's generation. Empowered by your Holy Spirit, may we serve with humility, not seeking to be chief over others, but rather to walk alongside our brothers and sisters, aiding each other in our pilgrimage. May we always be prepared, and in moments of difficult decision-making, may your Holy Spirit guide and fill our lives so that we can discern not only that which is best, but more importantly, that which is just and right in your sight. We give thanks for the opportunity to serve your church and to serve the world. Help us in our service to always remember that your word is true. You will honor those who remain faithful to the very end. May we then serve, knowing that at the end of our service, we will hear words of commendation from you. Well done, good and faithful servant. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so very much, Mikey. We invite Reverend Damon Mukandawire and Dr. Lisa Ajay to share with us their perspectives on Blacks in the ecumenical movement from a youth perspective.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my perspective on ecumenism as a young Black ecumenist. I am excited to engage with the insights shared in the first session and to offer thoughts on ecumenism and how it looks like from a youth perspective. First, I want to share my gratitude to my parents that have paved the way for us in the ecumenical movement. Their institutional memory and experiences are inevitable and valuable to guiding our path today. As we reflect on the participation of Black people in the ecumenical world, it is essential to recognize both the progress that has been made and the challenges that still exist. From the historical accounts that have been shared, it is evident that Black individuals have been integral to the ecumenical movement from its early days. Their contributions, though sometimes, and in my opinion, most of the times overlooked, have shaped the movement's values of unity, inclusivity, and social justice. It is important that we honor these contributions and ensure that they are not forgotten as we continue to uphold and build on this legacy. As a Black ecumenist, I see ecumenism as a dynamic and evolving concept. It is not just about bridging theological divides among Christian denominations. It is about creating spaces for dialogue and collaboration among people of different cultural, racial, and socioeconomic backgrounds. In today's interconnected world, ecumenism extends beyond the walls of the churches and encompasses a wide range of issues, including social issues, environmental sustainability, and human rights issues. For us as young people, ecumenism is not just a theoretical concept. We believe it is a lived experience. We are deeply connected to breaking down barriers and fostering understanding among different communities. Our generation values inclusivity and intersectionality. We seek to learn from each other's unique experiences and perspectives, acknowledging that true unity doesn't mean erasing the differences, but celebrating them. As young people, we believe that technology plays a significant role in shaping our approach to ecumenism. The ability to connect and collaborate globally allows us to build relationships and work towards common goals like never before. As we move forward, I believe it is critical to harness the power of technology to amplify marginalized voices, share diverse narratives, and advocate for justice on a larger scale. My parents, as we continue to reflect on the participation of Black people in the ecumenical world, it is clear that meaningful progress has been made, and we must celebrate that. But I believe that there is still work to be done. In order to truly embody the spirit of unity and inclusivity, it is essential that leadership roles reflect the diversity of the communities that we serve. Having diverse voices at the decision-making table ensures that wide range of perspectives are considered and that the movement's initiatives are more representative. For a young ecumenist like me, inclusion in leadership goes beyond representation. It involves creating an environment that nurtures and supports leaders from marginalized backgrounds. I'm excited to hear of the likes of Philip, who could find scholarships for young people. And in today's world, I ask, do we still have Philips? This requires addressing systematic barriers and biases that may hinder the advancement of Black individuals within the movement. Providing mentorship, training, and opportunities for leadership development is critical to empower young Black ecumenists to take up leadership roles with confidence and competence. I believe that our generation carries the responsibility to continue the legacies of those who have come before us while adapting to the unique challenges and opportunities of our time. In conclusion, I want to say that ecumenism for us is about embracing our shared humanity and celebrating the rich diversity. It is about dismantling systems of oppression, fostering meaningful connections, and working towards a more just, equitable world. We are excited to engage in this dialogue and to continue to contribute on the ongoing ecumenical movement. I believe that this is our time as we are nurtured and mentored as we take part in the ecumenical world. I thank you.
Thank you so very much, Damon. You have challenged us and given us a lot of food for thought. So, Lisa, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you so much. And a huge thanks to Reverend Damon, who went before me. I really do agree with your sentiments and your statements that you shared with us. I want to start by saying it's been wonderful to hear the stories and the great contributions of phenomenal Black leaders to the World Council of Churches over the years. And as a young leader, it's inspiring to hear and to see, and it's one that we must continue to celebrate. Their stories, their leadership, their accomplishments must be told far and wide. And as a lover of history, I loved hearing the journey and the dates and the timelines that were shared with us in that first session. And I'm reminded of this powerful quote by a young theologian and author, Cole Arthur Riley, that I often use when I'm speaking. And she says that it is not an individual, but a collective people who bear the image of God. This means that we need a diversity of people to reflect God more fully. Anything less and the image becomes pixelated and grainy, still beautiful, but lacking in clarity. And I love this imagery that she shares with us, because so often when history is told, it can be whitewashed, and the stories and the leadership and the accomplishments of Black leaders and their voices often are left out. And so today is an important day for us to retell and to tell the truth around the history and the journey of the World Council of Churches. I believe that there are many young people who are working and thinking ecumenically, but the reality is that many of them will not call it ecumenical. I was recently speaking at an event, and a lovely young woman was tasked with the job of introducing me. And she came over and tapped me on my shoulder before I was about to go up. And she asked me, how do I pronounce this particular word in my bio? And the word was ecumenical. And we spent a few minutes laughing back and forth as she practiced that word with her tongue and her mouth. And oftentimes for my generation, we are working in partnership, we're working across the divides, but most of us will not use the word ecumenist, ecumenical, because it's foreign to us. And I believe that we've caught the heart of it. The principle is the same, but the packaging is a little bit different. And so how does the new generation take on those principles and take on the lessons learned from the journeys and the stories that have come before, but package it in a way that works for our generation? I couldn't go any further but to honor a particular woman who is actually here today. I work for Christian Aid, a faith-based international development agency, but I wanted to honor Dion Grace Sunday. And most of you will know her, but she has been a phenomenal example of someone who works ecumenically. And for me, coming into this space and coming into this role, I've been so grateful for her wisdom and her support in being able to knock on her door and ask questions. And so often that intergenerational conversation and dialogue that happens where you're learning about what it looks like to work in partnership with others. And so just want to say a huge thank you to her. There's a strong theme of partnership and collaboration in our generation. As Reverend Damon mentioned, we love inclusion, we love participation, we love to go across those divides that may have been a barrier in previous generations. We don't have an intense interest in sometimes the invisible denominational boundaries or the subtle doctrinal differences that might be a barrier, but actually we're passionate about looking at relationship building right across those same divides. And there's a realization that if we're going to tackle some of the big issues of our time, we cannot do this alone. We must work together. Global problems require a global solution. Racial injustice, the legacies of transatlantic chattel slavery, colonization and neo-colonization, imperialism, climate injustice and the climate crisis, gender-based violence and economic injustice. These issues cannot be tackled by one particular group or denomination, but there's a recognition that the overwhelming giants that are before us require us to work across the divides. I have the honor of founding a racial justice community called Sankofa Collective. In Tree, it means to go back and get it. Sankofa, go back, return, and go and pick it up. And it's the idea that in order to walk forward well, you need to know your history. And so a day like today is amazing for me because my head is just spinning in so many different ways as we tell the truth around history. I also chair a global climate movement called Climate Yes, a group of young activists from different parts of the globe, but a huge number centered on the African continent. An ecumenical movement, seeing young people look at how we tackle climate injustice. These movements weren't born out of a desire to be ecumenical, but relationship and the mountain of injustice led us to the point of ecumenism. And so it's so important for us as a generation to look at ways in which ecumenism happened before us, the things that we can learn from the journeys and the practices that we want to take on and we want to continue with. We have much to learn about working together well, but I also believe that we have much to offer about working together in inclusion, in leadership, in intergenerational conversations, and in also our passion to fight injustice. And so thank you so much for the opportunity of being part of today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Dr. Lisa. You've invited us to think about those who mentored us, but to look forward to the ways in which we can mentor others and work together to tackle the giants. Who are these giants and what do they represent? So I invite all the panelists to join us in this moment as we think more practically, per se, about what ecumenism needs to look like in this new era where Christianity has gone south and Christendom is no longer located in the nexus of the global north. May I invite all of you to think about what it is you want to share with us and to challenge us in this moment. For those listening on, please don't think we've forgotten you. Rather, we invite you to be part of the conversation by placing your questions in the chat so that we can take note of your conversations and this journey will continue beyond today. Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis, Ms. Marilia Schuler, Reverend Professor Sam Kobia, Dr. Lisa Ajay, Reverend Damon Makandawire. You each have 3 minutes. 3 minutes. I invite you to sum your thoughts in 3 minutes. What will ecumenism look like?
So for me, it's really back to the future. We have always been there. As I said in my remarks, we may have been invisible to the broader dialogue and the broader narrative in the thinking of written texts and other public conversations, but we have always been there. And so as we move into the future, what will be critical is that we make visible what has been and what we are becoming. To me, the biggest difference is the visibility of where we've been. People of Africa and African descent were in the ancient days of the churches, not just the modern ecumenical movement, but the ancient days. I think it was Dr. Lewis who also made mention of the Bible and Africa being very present in the scriptures, for example. So as we look at indigenous heritage of people of Africa and African descent and other indigenous communities, and as we think about the ancient days, we are challenged to excavate very intentionally without a colonial lens of the stories and the future that have been there and will yet be. And so our charge is to change the lens and to change our hearts to welcome this opportunity to learn and to grow from what has been and what will become. Knowing one's history, as we are a Sankofa people, is the foundation for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis, please weigh in, and she'll be followed by Marilia Schuler.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm back on. I don't want to so much cast a vision as to cast some issues that I think we need to tackle in shaping that vision. And I'm thankful particularly to Lisa, if you don't mind my calling you Lisa, for the last thing that she said, or among the last things she said, that young people have something to offer. Okay, so I am just tabling 4 or so issues. One is technology. And that's probably because we have been talking about ChatGPT, and I've been experimenting with, can ChatGPT give me the exegesis for a sermon? And some of you would have seen online that there was a service in Germany that was done using AI. So I think post-pandemic, issues about live streaming and how people consume church now, and the issues posed by AI. So can the Holy Spirit inspire AI to write a sermon that I just read off, or that the chatbot reads itself? I'm just being provocative here, but you understand what I'm saying. I think ideology and keeping that focus on the justice, inclusion, and belonging agenda is going to be really important, because we do have, let me call it, differences within the African community. And one that I want to highlight is the LGBTQ plus community. We seem much more ambivalent about including gay brothers and sisters in the Imago Dei than most of the other diversity issues. So one has to deal with justice and those exegetical and theological issues around identity. And I think also wider issues around politics, which leads me to the post-colonial situation. A lot of us are focusing on Africa, and what's the significance of the rise of China and Russia? What's the legacy that's still with us? It was pointed out in the news here that the most recent military coups on the continent were countries with a French colonial history. So how do we go a little deeper into the conversations around empire and ideology, and what do we carve out for ourselves? I think reparations is the other one, and I'll wrap this up soon. And I would see reparations as both external from those who owe us and internal in the sense of repair. And I table Pan-Africanism, particularly by Marcus Garvey, as something that we need to revisit in the fracturing that I'm seeing on the North American continent among people of African descent. And finally, the interfaith relationship, the dialogue of life. I think it has to go beyond interchurch, but that idea right embedded within the WCC literature and experience, that we are all in a dialogue of life that has to include people of different faiths and ideologies, and others who are like the indigenous persons and so, who have been harmed and have intergenerational trauma from colonialism and the doctrine of discovery. So I'm just tabling some of those as issues that we need to consider in crafting the vision of the future.
Write the vision, make it plain. Marilia, what is your vision?
Thank you very much, Nicole. I'm so grateful for all that was shared here already, and I took notes. I took it to my heart as well, and I would like to mention a few elements. Being nowadays very close to local churches and to the work of the church in different institutions here at the local level. I think I have a few concerns that I think are quite challenging, continue to be a challenge. And one of them is, are the churches at the local level addressing racism in their own backyard? Are the churches teaching, reflecting, addressing matters that relate to our societies beyond our local church, but relates to the society as the community of people that live in the city? So how are churches around the world doing it, and from an ecumenical view, from an approach that is transformative in searches for justice at the local level? So that is one. And the other one is a question to at what extent there is a visible expression of Black people's participation in the life of the churches as protagonists, not only as in some situations as objects of care and attention in public service, but as protagonists of their own lives, as protagonists of the life of the churches, as protagonists of the life of our societies in the transformation that we are part of and would like to be part of. I also believe that the question of the decolonial approach is a crucial issue, not only in theology, but also in the way we live our lives, what we read, what we give value to. There is a whole process of decolonial thinking that should come down to the grassroots level as well. And I think the churches do have a role on that. And obviously, I want to underline again an issue that was mentioned here a few times, that is the matter of transformative justice as being relating to the issue of reparations. I do not believe that we can achieve economic justice in the world if there is no restitution and reparation for matters related to slavery and the whole situation of Africans and African descent people around the world. So thank you very, very much. It's an honor here amongst you all.
Thank you so much. So it's the decolonizing approach, and of course, ensuring that we look at issues of justice, peace, and inclusion. Professor Sam Kobia, then Dr. Lisa Ajay, and Reverend Damon Makanda-Wire. Prof?
Well, thank you very much once again, Nicole. And let me begin by stating that the global Christianity has shifted to the South, where evangelical and Pentecostal youth movements are alive with energy and dynamism, but these are not part of the conciliar ecumenical movement, which is represented at the world level by WCC, the regional level by regional ecumenical organizations, and at the local level, national councils of churches. Now, secondly, I want to say that I see a big challenge in ecumenical formation or lack of it. The traditional youth and lay training centers that some of us were trained in are either dead or are struggling to survive. I think of the Limuru Conference and Training Center in Kenya, Church and Society Institute in Ibadan, Nigeria, Mindolo Ecumenical Formation in Zambia, or even Stony Point in New York. These were the spaces of training, and this is where we were formed as ecumenists. Unless there is a total transformation of spaces and grounds for ecumenical formation in the global South, we can say that ecumenism in the 21st century will decline in its influence and in its relevance in the society. But I see evangelical, Pentecostal, and Catholic movements as the ones that will influence the type of ecumenism that we are going to have in the 21st century, which will be very different from the one envisioned by a conciliar ecumenical movement, which is a search for visible unity. 3, I want to say that the Global Christian Forum, which has the space or platform for conciliar ecumenical churches, Catholics, evangelicals, and the Pentecostals, if the Global Christian Forum will not be revitalized, then there is very little chance that we will have a strong ecumenical movement in the 21st century. But having said that, let me say there is hope. During my first 2 years as the General Secretary of WCC, I traveled the world, and I must say that I witnessed again and again surprising signs of hope. People celebrate life in places where, humanly speaking, one could only see death and despair. It is this capacity to celebrate together that strengthens life in a community, and that is what has kept people going. And unless we rediscover that, then ecumenism in the 21st century is not going to be strong. I would like to say that for the people to have a hope for the people of God, we must discover the presence of the grace of God in each other on the common journey as we walk together. For that to happen, however, I discern 5 assertions of an ecumenical movement open to the science of God's transformative grace as a movement of life. And these 5 assertions are, number 1, grounded in spirituality. Unless the ecumenical movement is grounded in spirituality, it will not go very far. Secondly, it takes ecumenical formation and the youth seriously. Third, it dares to work for transformative justice. Fourth, it puts relationships at the center. And the fifth and finally, it takes risks to develop new and the creative ways of working away from the rigidity of our structures. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Kabir. So, Dr. Ajay, your thoughts?
Thank you. I think what I would add to the many great points offered so far, and these words just sort of come to mind as I was thinking about it, is power, power, power. And as someone sitting in the global north, we need to get behind leaders of the global south and global majority. And I think sometimes framing it as global majority leaders, I saw something in the chat around what about African Americans in North America, helps us to reframe it a little bit better. And what we would say for Climate Yes is we need to pass the microphone. So how are we following that up with the shift in power? If the center of Christianity has shifted from Europe and from white North America, then how are we passing the microphone to those voices that are now at the center of us as a faith and as a movement? I learned last year, I was able to attend a conference here in the UK, and I learned that the average Anglican is a young Nigerian woman. And my question is, how does that shape the rest of the Anglican Communion? How does that shape the church that's situated here in the global north? You know, what does that mean for them? Are they hearing the voices of young Nigerian women? You know, does it have any impact in the power dynamics that are at play? And I'm thinking of things like theological training. The books that are read, the quotes that are put forward during sermons, the leadership faces that you see, the songwriters and their voices, all of those things matter. So if there is a shift in the center, there should be a shift in power and in the voices that you hear. And so that's my small contribution to the conversation that we're having.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Damon, are you all about a shift in power also?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, for that. As Christianity shifts to the global south, I'm reminded that the majority in the global south are young people. And so it is very important to then focus on equipping the young people. It is important that the young people are given the mic, that the young people are given the platforms to speak, like it is now, young people given the chance to be heard. I tried to look at the attendance and of this meeting, and I was asking myself, how many of young people are present? I look forward to a time when the mic is passed on to young people to continue to speak, and that there is empowerment in the lives of these young people, so that they are able to become part of decision-making processes and decision-making tables. But I also see that as we move, as Christianity shifts, that we must emphasize on interfaith dialogue, as it has been alluded to, that we must bridge the gap between Christianity and other faith traditions, so that together we continue to bring things on the table and discuss them and bring life to the whole world at the end of the day. But I also want to talk about one last thing. Technology is something that has been talked about, but I want to look at one thing that is focusing on local contexts. We find that the global south, where Christianity has shifted to, has its own economic, political, and social problems. I pray that as we look at the shift, we also look at how to address issues of poverty, issues of social injustice, issues of political instability. Today we hear of coups happening in African countries, but how does the ecumenical church then position herself to respond to those issues that are taking place within the African context and communities? I believe that when we do that, then the church is going to be relevant to communities out there. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Damon, Lisa, Sam, Marilia, Marjorie, Angelique, these have been our hosts in reflecting on those who were gathered. We pause to thank them, and you can use your reaction button or just place thank you in the chat, as we appreciate their efforts to bring us to this space. Siblings, we're not 100% done, because there is need for us to respond to even one question. At this moment, I want to recognize that this program, this webinar could not have been possible but without the mastermind behind this, my colleague, my brother, my friend, Dr. Masiwa Gunda. Masiwa, can you take us through the closing moments before you hand over to Mikey? Over to you, Masiwa, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I don't even know where to begin. I don't know how to express my joy at the event and the learnings that we have had today. There were 4 questions that were in the chat, one of which I think Damon has tried or indirectly responded to. And as our time will not allow us to respond to these, I will just read these questions out. And for those that have emails, we can try and reach out to each other and continue to have these conversations. one of the questions, or I just read the 4 questions. In what ways will WCC plan to take up the truth and accountability call about the sins of slave trade, colonialism, neocolonialism, and the lingering consequences of racism? Second question, what is the position of the ecumenical movement for the current and many coups in West Africa that have denied prosperity of democracy in West African countries? How is WCC prepared to deal with challenges of ecumenism in hostile countries in Africa due to political instability and racism that is practiced? And finally, what ways will the WCC undertake in the current state of the church in Kenya? So these were questions that came from participants, and I do hope that in one way or the other, we will find a way of dealing with these. And those that want to continue some of these conversations, please reach out on our emails, and we will be very happy to continue these engagements. Now, like I said, I don't know how to sum up such a beautiful event like this. But first, let me thank our moderator today, Reverend Nikki Ashwood, a sister across the corridor here at the WCC. So I'm really thankful for the way you have steered this ship. I want to thank all the presenters this afternoon. They have given us a lecture in history, but also a lecture in forward looking and forward planning. And I have seen a lot of people that have come on board today. I want to thank all of you for making time to be part of this commemoration of the International Day of People of African Descent, but also the 75th anniversary commemoration or celebration of the World Council of Churches. Now, there are just a few things that I want to reiterate from what has happened today. First, Philip Porter, as a young man, a youth, spoke at the 1948 First Assembly of the World Council of Churches. That is a challenge for us today. I always want to think I'm young, but the reality is I'm no longer. What are we doing to pass on the mic, to pass on the baton? This is a challenge. But I also wonder, and I don't know how many of us here are also wondering why we are seeing so far ahead of us. And what today has done to me, a man of my stature, and I'm not that tall, thankfully I'm sitting, so you guys cannot see it. But I am seeing so far away because I am standing on the shoulders of giants that have gone ahead of us, that have paved the way for us, that have given us the pedestal to stand on so we can see far away. But are we also making the right pedestals for those behind us so they can see even further ahead? So I am so grateful, and I've learned from the young voices that ecumenism, if it is to survive into the future, it must embrace inclusivity. It must embrace an idea of borderlessness, and it must begin to rethink the structuredness that we have for so long embraced and extolled. Maybe we need to imagine ecumenism as the rivers and the waters that permeate, that are able to find their way into all spheres of our life. What today has done is that it has shown us that there is a past, but what it has also done, and for me in a very powerful way, is that ecumenism is here to stay. Because I look at Damon, And I was saying myself, I was like that some years ago. And I'm looking at Lisa and I'm looking at her and saying, I was once there. So ecumenism does have a future. I want to thank you, Lisa and Damon particularly, because you have shown us that ecumenism is not retiring anytime soon. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I want to thank finally Mike and Walter. I've already thanked Nikki. Walter has been our technical expert accompanying us this afternoon alongside Marcelo, and Mikey has been our chaplain. So I want to thank you all for this wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
And thank you, Masiwa, for all of your hard work in certainly planning and envisioning this webinar, this program today. And as an act of solidarity, even though this is a program that we would normally invite persons to unmute themselves, I'm going to invite us all to unmute and let us join in the grace together as a way of showing our connectedness, and that whether we are in global north, south, east, or west, all stay together in the grace of our Lord. So here we go. The grace of our Lord
and Savior Jesus Christ, the love of God, fellowship of the Holy Spirit, rest, remain, and rule forever and forever.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you.
We'll have a closing video as we make our way out. So don't quite leave yet. There's a video that will take us out. Over to you, Walter.
Mission at the heart of it is really theological, because according to our own approach to mission within the WCC, we believe that first and foremost, mission is God's. So we participate in what God is already doing in the world. That's the fundamental theological tenet, that we uphold. And so in that regard, we go into spaces not as initiators, but the word discernment that we use when we talk about reading the signs of the time, understanding what is happening during our time, and discerning where God is already at work. Not necessarily through WCC structures, but through people of goodwill, through other initiatives that may not necessarily be WCCs, but also we ourselves then initiate as we discern, but fundamentally we stem from our belief in a God who cares for the world, loves the world, and has a purpose and a goal for the world, and so we engage with that.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. In what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. We will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.